In the Battle of Oklahoma City, during the invasion through fourth-generation warfare doctrines, as Trojan shock armies throughout the entire nation, including in this battle space of Oklahoma City and its metropolitan area, all emerged from their CCP regime properties to rapidly seize and secure their various objectives, with military objectives being at the absolute top of the proverbial list, in conjunction with as well as interstates and major routes for key logistical purposes, as well as infrastructure, in addition to highways such as airstrips and power plants and water and sewage treatment plants, as well as fuel facilities, whether they be fuel storage facilities or refineries or even pipelines themselves. As the Americans had deployed their forces to try and make an attempt at protecting some of their critical infrastructure within this Oklahoma City metropolitan area, Trojan shock forces were already on the move, and by 12:30, 30 minutes after the green light of the invasion, with the tandem satellite strikes with the anti-satellite weapons and as well as the tandem cyber strike, the electronic warfare systems that booted on in many areas, including within this battle space, being carried out by the Electronic Warfare Battalion of the 58th Signals Regiment, were also playing a vital role in the suppression of American communications, pinpointing the exact origins of radio and radar signals and jamming them. This equipment was quite delicate and needed to be protected at all costs. And although there was already intelligence and an awareness that there were armed American militia personnel within this particular battle space, as they began to congregate near the key CCP regime properties of the 58th Logistical Support Brigade of the PLA's 58th Group Army, the 58th Signals Regiment, and the Independent Headquarters Battalion, it was decided that the 58th Special Operations Battalion, already pre-designated and earmarked for a special operations deep strike mission into the cap area of the city itself, the state capital region, the state capital complex, to capture the political and some of the military leadership that were even there. They were being guarded, in particular, by a single battery from the 1st of the 160th Artillery Battalion, which was actually guarding the actual Capitol complex. And although many of these other companies comprising this battalion, or batteries rather, as it was an artillery battalion, were being hit by various counter-battery strikes, the surgical precision of these special operators, many of which having ample combat experience from the Syrian civil conflict, having rotated through different other special operations units that had deployed there, had some of these personnel within this battalion, and they were also extremely highly trained, among the best in the world, as it related to Chinese special operations forces in general. And as they were earmarked to be flown in a shuttle mission by the Transportation Battalion of the 58th Aviation Regiment, flying on the outer periphery of the battle space, flying at treetop level and maneuvering and bobbing and weaving rapidly to avoid any chance of any type of small arms fire from any enemy ground personnel, they would fly into the area where these special operators would be tasked with being an elite infantry force in support of the armored battalion tasked with assaulting this moderately sized grouping of fairly well-equipped and well-trained and experienced American militia personnel, many of them having experience in previous foreign wars, or at least had training, as there were American militia forces all throughout the country in various areas, and many of them were now appearing in many battle spaces. And this particular area where they were materializing at the outer city limits of the northwestern portions of the metropolitan area of Oklahoma City, they were a direct threat to the electronic warfare battalion of the 58th Signals Regiment. And although these forces, the headquarters battalion's forces, the electronic warfare, and the rest of the Signals Regiment were armed with their standard issue small arms and some crew serve weapons and could definitely defend themselves, the equipment operated was highly delicate and could not be put at risk. And although it was highly unlikely that the Americans even knew that these forces were directly north of them, approximately 5 miles away, the risk was still too much to take, and these forces had to be dealt with swiftly. So the artificial intelligence system responsible for assisting in the flexibility and management of personnel and resources had deemed it of vital importance to deploy the 58th Special Operations Battalion in support of the Assaulting Armored Battalion and Mechanized Infantry Battalion that, along with the Short Range Air Defense Battalion belonging to the 190th Combined Arms Brigade here, had recently moved in and seized control of the Sundance Airport, or the Canadian County Municipal Airport, in other words, before sending further on the Mechanized Infantry Battalion while leaving the Air Defense Battalion to hold their new acquisition, as these forces would rapidly crush these armed Americans and not even give them the opportunity to break out of their current muster and assembly area where they were now coming together. There were also common reactionary armed civilians within the area too that lived within the area that were now emerging from their homes, as well as these militia-like forces. These militia-like forces were armed and equipped like standard Army infantrymen, many having plate carriers and body armor of their own and helmets, as well as sporting rifles, which were not all that different, really, from the standard military issue rifles. These forces were congregating at the time of 1 a.m., and within 30 minutes, these Chinese PLA forces from the 190th Combined Arms Brigade and the Independent Special Operations Battalion, which was to move in and help assault these forces by providing elite infantry support to the Armored Battalion, although it had its own armored infantry companies within it, the extra punch of the Special Operations Battalion would ensure that this force would be extremely rapidly dealt with. So therefore, the shuttling would also begin as these forces were fighting. Companies of the Special Operations Battalion would be shuttled out of the area to their landing zone in the city, in the downtown area, as the helos would fly back and forth, picking up another company, moving them in, flying back and shuttling another company in. They would do this as the fighting was going on, and by the time the fighting was over with, the last company would be pulled out, leaving only the headquarters company, which drove the entire battalion's vehicles, as the drivers, TCs, and gunners of all of the different vehicles of this Special Operations Battalion were members of the headquarters company itself, leaving the personnel of the other foot-based companies, the operator companies, to serve as dismounts to be able to board these vehicles and dismount from them, leaving the headquarters company to operate them. As this was set to occur, the fighting already was beginning by, again, 1:30 in this area. Also, at the same time, as other battles were going on at the Tinker Air Force Base, and a large grouping of armed civilians now being heavily shelled and assaulted by the mechanized infantry forces, 2 battalions from 2 different combined arms brigades, both the 93rd and 53rd sending in a battalion each, with the attack helicopters moving in as they were clearing the flanks for their major assault against the military forces that were now guarding critical infrastructure within the area. As these forces were moving in like spokes on a wheel, in their strategic maneuvering to seize control of the city by capturing key nodes before then fanning out and conducting proper cordons and sweeps, which would occur later. But for this point in time, this was all ISR directed by all the threats appearing on the map, so to speak. As other armed civilians were now moving, as well as the Chinese forces were moving, although many chose to stay and fight in the city and would ultimately perish, the most wise among the armed civilians had by this point already either fled the area and left the city for the countryside, or they were hiding in a labyrinth of underground sewers and tunnels and basements throughout the city. It would take a while to root all of them out, and some would never be rooted out and would stay on as partisan elements after the Chinese victory and conquest of America. At this particular battle, it was occurring in a part of an area that straddled a urbanized quasi-industrial and commercial area and a semi-rural suburban area, as this was occurring around the city limits itself, along the Oklahoma River. Going to the map, the fighting in the area in the northern part would have looked particularly like this, with Chinese forces in their various tactical formations like this wedge formation and this line formation, much like in the Fort Hood battle, firing their weapons, exchanging fire in a firefight, as you can see the rounds smacking the ground around these guys here, and these guys firing back in a incoming 35 millimeter tube-fired grenade from beneath one of the QBZ-95 rifles and the exchange, while the helos would be flying into the area to pick up a company at a time as they were fighting and reducing this pocket that they had created that extended 5 miles total north to south and 3 miles east to west. This was a fairly large area. This was the northernmost section here. This particular map being a 1.5 mile by 1 mile segment of the far northern part of the map, and this part of the map being at the far south, with heavy rocket strikes even called in upon many of these armed American civilians spotted by both local quadcopter platoon and squad level reconnaissance assets in the form of their drones at the squad and platoon levels of these ground forces, as well as the high altitude WZ-8 stealth reconnaissance drones circling the entire battlefield, which was the city and its metropolitan area, calling in various targets for destruction, as the squad and platoon level drones and company level drones and even the high altitude macro level drones all work together to map out the area and constantly update the forces through their combat data links and the artificial intelligence processing all the real-time live action combat data, as this was steadily updated by the second as the fluid back and forth battlefield conditions were constantly mapped out and processed and sent back to the ground forces. In the north, the Special Operations Forces were deploying in this particular part of the fight one of their regular companies consisting of one squad here, one squad here, one here, one here, and one here, this being one whole platoon of the combat troops of the Special Operations Forces. Then there was a squad here, a squad here, a squad here, and a squad here. This being another platoon. And then you had a squad here. Well, actually, this squad was part of this platoon. And you had a platoon here. You had one squad, one squad, one squad, 2 half squads, which was a squad, and then a squad here by these railroad tracks. And then you had an armored company out of the 4 armored companies in the armored battalion, with the 2 armored infantry companies to the south, the anti-tank company in the middle with another tank company, and the mechanized infantry moving into the south as well to support this large battle by sweeping and destroying this large area in a rapid amount of time. This platoon right here of 5 Type 96B main battle tanks was in this northernmost portion. There was another one right here, Type 96B main battle tanks belonging to this tank company deployed in this specific area, and another platoon right here going down this road. And then there was another platoon right here, fanned out, but along this road here. And the Special Operations troops were serving, again, as elite infantry in this particular operation. There was an LZ, or a landing zone, off-map, where different companies would be withdrawn from the larger battle from throughout the area, and they would move to the LZ for pickup and would be picked up by the Z-20 transport helos of the transport helicopter battalion moving into the area to pick them up to move them into the new operation going on in the downtown area, where they would be linking up with heavier units such as mechanized infantry and armored and combat engineer battalions of the different combined arms brigades that were to be moving into the area of downtown to lock it down and secure it, with the Special Operations troops moving in to do a lightning strike against the cap area of the city, as well as the local city hall, to capture the local political leadership as well, as the deck of cards had many wanted people on it, from political leadership to military leadership and more, even militia leadership in some states, as each state had its own deck of cards, similar to the one used by Americans in Iraq for the former Iraqi regime members. These vehicles here were all part of the headquarters company of the Special Operations Battalion. So these were all driven and operated by the headquarters company. And they had driven into the area, driving the troops from their CCP property into battle before dismounting all of them. And this was only one grouping. This was only one company of vehicles. This is just the company's part of their vehicles right here, as they had a whole array of vehicles, as the entire company operated the vehicles and the gun turrets on these vehicles when it came to the combat vehicles, such as these vehicles right here, which were the EQ 250s, which were similar to a Humvee, but they had a 12.7 millimeter turret on the top, and they looked similar to a Humvee. And they also had MRAPs, and they also had Shangji trucks. They had a fueler, armored recovery vehicles, and basically that was it for their vehicles as it pertained to the Special Operations Battalion. Now, they had a heavy special weapons company, which had a mortar platoon with 82 millimeter mortars. This was just one of the two mortar sections. They had an FPV drone platoon. This is just one section out of that platoon. There were more off map supporting the rest of the battle. And they also had a robotics platoon as part of this heavy special weapons company, and they also had snipers with the robotics platoon. They consisted of one platoon together, sniper and spotter teams with the robotics operators. These forces were now already engaged in combat, with the Special Operations troops having fanned out to clear all of these wooded areas, having had stumbled upon a farm right here where there was a lot of activity of armed civilians, with these two squads having moved into position to conduct a closing L formation against the farm as the armor moved into the area to offer them fire support from this way to avoid friendly fire. There, at this point in time, this early in the battle, were combat air patrols being flown over the area by a pair of J-11 fighter jets right here. And they were doing combat air patrols, and although they were armed with minimal ground attack munitions due to the fact that at this point in time, this was early in the invasion, so the threat of enemy air activity needed to be dealt with in case it somehow managed to arise. Therefore, they would be flying their air superiority / combat air patrol operations for total air dominance over the area until they were positive there was no more American Air Force left, as within the first 5 hours, much of it would be destroyed on the ground, with whatever was in the air having been shot down by that point. by the time that they did their first RTB, they would be able to return and get not only any needed maintenance done and fuel refilled, but they would also be rearmed with ground attack munitions. And although there were mid-air refuelers to keep them airborne for a long time, they would eventually all have to return to their bases in Mexico for fuel, any potential maintenance operations, and rearmament. So at this point in time, they only had a few ground attack munitions, but they could also be called in to strafe enemy targets with their nose cannon ammunition, which was very devastating. As this fight was going on here, these special operations troops, armed with standard small arms, Type 69 RPG systems, which were produced in such massive amounts, they were ubiquitous throughout the PLA. I mean, almost every soldier had access to them. They were all throughout the vehicles, and they could grab them if they needed them, and they had the anti-personnel and anti-tank rounds. Anti-tank rounds, of course, were best against vehicles or even light bunkers and homes and places like that, with the anti-personnel rounds being devastating against personnel targets in particular, of course. They had tube-fired 35mm grenades from beneath rifle barrels of those that had those. They had hand grenades. They had QJS 201s, which were their squad automatic weapon, their light machine gun. And they had either QBZ-95s or QBZ-03s, which were the newest rifle. They had their pick of weapons, as these were special operators, and they could choose whatever was tailored to the mission at the time. And some of them even had heavier weapons like HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, which would utterly devastate a house. It would completely blow it to scrap wood. As these forces were closing in on this farm, and they were receiving heavy firepower from these tanks, firing fragmentation shells and heavy machine gun fire from their turret machine guns, as well as also coax machine gun fire from the 7.62 by 54mm coax fire, they shredded through these buildings in conjunction with these forces bounding and covering. They would move, lay down, lay down in the prone in a line, lay down fire. Then they would fire, get up, move, lay down, fire, and then they would get up, move, stop, lay down, fire, and then they would move, stop, lay down, fire. And then by the time they got to this position here, this squad broke up into two elements and went to clear the barn and also around the corner here, as there were enemies around the corner, but most of them had been wiped out by the time they got here because the tanks had been firing heavily into this area here with fragmentation shells blasting and 12.7mm fire shredding through these buildings. I mean, these guys were wiped out quick. I mean, there was no casualties, although at first there was a little bit of a firefight, as indicated by the green, and including the green with these tanks, as the turret gunners were even fired at, but they weren't hit. And these forces, as this operation was going on, there were many things happening ubiquitously in this particular battle. As that was happening, also was happening was this squad here, just to their slight northwest by about a football field distance, began to bound and stop while these forces were firing into this area. And they held their position here because they wanted to avoid friendly fire. And while their ammunition, as all this was ISR and AI directed, the standard small arms ammunition wouldn't have gone too terribly far, as, you know, most of this ammunition really only had a range of about 800 to 1,000 meters. So by the time it got here, it would have been safe, relatively speaking. And these forces were firing this way and this way, doing the same closing L. And these Americans had experience and or training, and they got in a diamond formation and tried to fight back. And they fired back as effectively as they could, but they just couldn't succeed, and they were eventually mowed down by the vectoring of fire coming two different ways at them. And not only that, but by the time these forces got here, they had assisted as well. And off in the far northwest here, on the very edge, at the very opening of this fight right here, this squad in this wedge formation had been in a firefight with this group of armed civilian militia troops right here, and they wiped them out before advancing with this squad to the road before they were to take different directions along the road, with them crossing the road and moving this way. All as this armored platoon moved and smashed their way through this large wooded area before maneuvering out and around and seizing control and blocking the road from that way, along with these troops moving up to support them. All as this was going on, FPV drone operators from the FPV drone section here were launching FPV drones. Now, these carried a massive payload that could destroy everything from tanks to groupings of personnel. And these were quadcopter, basically kamikaze drones, these FPV drones. They were a little different than the loitering munitions, as they were quadcopter based, and the loitering munitions were essentially like a jet propelled flying system. It was like a kamikaze jet drone in a way. Now, all of that, in conjunction with the mortar fire, levied heavy destruction, as all of this ISR-directed fire had spotted armed civilians running out of this trailer park right here. The people that lived here that grabbed their weapons and decided to fight alongside of the armed civilian militias that they knew were already in the area, because, again, the call to arms was being yelled as people drove their pickup trucks throughout the area, like this one here that got hit by a tank shell. As these tanks could hit moving targets with ease due to their laser rangefinder, ballistic computers, and fire control systems, these tanks could not only hit moving targets, but they could hit moving targets while they were moving themselves, of course, as most battle tanks can do, most modern tanks. And this pickup truck, as it moved here, was hit by a shell and destroyed by a fragmentation tank shell. These two that were in the intersection were completely hit by tank shells and destroyed. As this force, this platoon of armor, flanked on each side by a squad on each side of special operators serving as their elite infantry support, moved down the road, and by the time they got here, they were taking fire from this wood line, but they had fired back, causing them to run, but they were cut down as they ran through this wooded area. And although these guys were firing and they were starting to take heavy fire, they ran and bolted across the street, as you can tell by this red arrow right here. They were taking heavy fire by this point. And as that was going on, these tanks were on the move again. And they were about to get to this position here, going around this wooded area. And by the time they got here, they had made it to join this group of 4 men. And the survivors of this group went with this group here, but they were all cut down by the heavy volume of fire that was coming in from these forces moving down the road. These infantry, well, basically special operator infantry squads, along with the tank platoon moving with them. This was extremely heavy as a force. And on the flanks, all of these houses were being cleared by a squad right here that were going through the back doors, kicking the doors in and moving through like a stack team, and then going out the front here. And before they had even gotten into this house, there was a firefight, as you can tell by this green right here on the end of the arrow. It means they took some fire, but they returned fire and cut these 2 guys down that were hiding behind the house and ran out. They already knew these guys were hiding here. They could see them with their quadcopter reconnaissance assets. And it was all relayed back to the combat data links, not just in the vehicles, but on the PDAs, the tiny PDA battle combat data links that were held by the squad leaders and platoon leaders at the platoon levels. As they raided this house and then went out, they went into this wooded area and then moved once more to take position right here. As these forces now moved into position here, with the armored forces moving ahead just a bit more to get a more precise bead on these forces here, as they had their night vision and IR and image intensifying optics that could see very far, and they could lob their tank shells over at this group here, right over this hilly terrain here in this wooded area. They could fire right over here. And as that was happening, as these armored forces had made it past here, as this closing L formation had since concluded, with the squad here, by the time they got here, breaking into 2 half squads to raid this remaining pieces of this barn that were still left. This building was extremely gutted by the fragmentation shells that impacted outside of it, and the shredding of the 12.7 millimeter fire that raked right through the building. These buildings were like Swiss cheese. They were completely torn up, and there were bodies everywhere. And by the time they kicked open this barn door and raided this building, all they found were dead, KIA'd. There was really nobody in there, as indicated by this red. They were all KIA'd, or the red could mean they were captured, but in this instance they were eliminated by the tank fire because the tanks were firing at them as they were taking fire at that point in time. And as these forces moved into the area, they checked the house. They kicked open this door to the remains of this shot-up house, and then they kicked out the front door, and then they bolted this way. And they began to bound and cover with this squad that was on the move again. And by the time it reached here, they bounded together and covered with this squad right here, as you can see. As they bounded and stopped here and laid down fire, this squad bounded ahead, stopped, laid down fire. And then this squad bounded once more, laid down fire. And then this squad bounded across the street, laid down fire. They moved tactically like that. And then, as you can see here, this platoon of tanks, by the time it got here, the tanks spread out in different directions right here like this. And this was just the armor right here. And these forces of this special operations squad that had passed through this area had moved in to support the armor. This was them right here. And this tank moved up here, and by this point it was taking a little bit of fire. There was a huge group of armed civilian militiamen running this way. As rocket artillery was crashing, as well as howitzer artillery, off-map, and was eliminating hundreds of them, causing many to flee into this area, which was like a trap. It was like a hammer and anvil type of thing. They were jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire with running into these forces. As the armor here had moved up a bit, the squad moved right here beside this tank that was right here where my finger is. This squad moved right here, and they were laying down fire with the armor, this tank here, moving up here beside it to offer this squad some protection. As these FPV drones moved in to the area with some CH-901A loitering munitions that had been fired by the headquarters battalion of the 190th Combined Arms Brigade, having fired them in support of all their forces, including their armored battalion and mechanized infantry battalion that were fighting in this area, as well as giving support to the special operators that were assisting the armored forces in the north. This is a large area, so it had to be thoroughly and methodically swept in order to cleanse it of any potential threats of any type of guerrilla fighters against the sensitive equipment of the Electronic Warfare Battalion. This was a very intense battle right here. And as the tanks moved through the area and completely slaughtered everybody they encountered, it was a devastating combination of the special operators and the armor working together. And in the south, the mechanized infantry, armored infantry, and other Type 96B armored companies, along with their anti-tank company consisting of their armored battalion, consisting of their 8 pod apiece AFT-10, HJ-10 missile systems. They could fire a heavy volume of fire with their anti-tank company, which could fly a total distance, if needed, of 6.2 miles, twice the distance of a tow missile, and it was much more powerful. It was devastating against buildings, tanks, and groupings of personnel. These forces now moved in as these buildings were completely destroyed by tank shells. These FPV drones moved in, loitering munitions moved in, tank shells were flying, small arms fire was coming in from these squads that had moved from here by this point across the road and now moved into this area, along with this tank moving up with them to provide them support. These troops that moved through here and eliminated this diamond formation that had moved across the road were now, having had fought off these forces in conjunction with these two squads having moved here and fired at them with the FPV drones coming into this wooded area to kill off the rest of them with the 82mm mortar strikes, all drone directed. These guys were wiped out immediately. Like there wasn't even any chance to fight back from this wooded area here. So they were completely slaughtered. And as these two squads moved into this area to take position here, along with this squad eventually getting here, the squad that was here eventually, after crossing the street, got here. And the armor was moving up along with them to provide support to clear the area. as that was now the main goal. As this tank moved up, it took a little bit of fire from some of these guys, but all the return fire, there was so much happening at once. I mean, it's difficult, as always, to show this in any coherent order, but it's being attempted. So by the time they were taking a little bit of fire as they were moving in, and all of this was going on at about the same time, all these movements, they had been laying down so much fire in return. It obliterated this house, this barn, and all of these forces being hit, not just by the mortars up here and the mortars down here, which these guys fleeing from the trailer park this way were getting annihilated by mortars and HE warhead laden CH-901As striking them, and tank shell fire and more. I mean, even sometimes the tanks would fire ATGMs into their target areas, as the ATGMs had really good range and could fly over this area and hit groupings of enemy personnel that were a bit further away than the tank shells. And the tank shells had over 3 mile range anyway. I mean, these weapon systems were devastating. I mean, all of these were. And the sheer combination of the FPV drones, the CH-901As, the tank-based weapons like the tank's main gun, its heavy machine gun, coax machine gun, the weapons of the special operators like the small arms, the RPG systems they had, the anti-tank missiles that some of them had, the tube-fired grenades, mixing all of this together was just devastating. The mortars, the armed robots were operating in a different area, so they weren't in this particular battle, but they even had air power available in the form of the 2 passing fighters if they needed them to strafe or drop their limited 500-pound munitions on enemy targets, but they didn't need it. This was over extremely quick. This battle here lasted only an hour in the north. I mean, they had to do all of this movement and tactically destroy each and every hard point they came up upon, whether it was a farm or a home with enemy personnel trying to hide in them, or this trailer park right here. There was artillery and even rocket artillery called into the south from the far afield 77th Artillery Battalion's A300 brigades, the 77th Artillery Brigade's A300 battalion, which the A300 was the longest range and most powerful rocket artillery system in the world. It was a 300 millimeter system like others, but it had a much longer range. It was the longest in the world at a whopping 187 miles. It could really reach out and touch somebody. It could hit many different battle spaces that were all going on at the same time to the Oklahoma City battle, such as the Shepherd Air Base battle from where they were in southern Oklahoma and Fort Sill. They could hit targets in Fort Sill, Dallas, Shepherd Air Base, and Oklahoma City. They had a wide range of capabilities with that system, and the A300 would be called upon to saturate armed civilians, and it was already being used off the map in conjunction with artillery fire that was coming from the artillery battalions Type 83 152 millimeter shells, which were being fired into this area, and the A300s coming in from the Fort Sill area that were crashing into the middle and southern portions. But they were so devastating that it was being felt off the map in this northernmost area as well here. These forces being hit by all of this concentration of firepower here, and this group right here, is this arrow is completely encapsulated in red, because by this point in time, the tank shells, all these FPV drones, CH-901As, and more, all the small arms and crew serve fire just completely annihilated these forces that were concentrating in this area, that were fleeing from artillery fire that was blasting behind them, and the mortar fire called in from the mortars here and off map. It was deadly precise. I mean, there were a lot of these guys that got wiped out as they fled out of the trailer park over the fence into the woods. These guys were getting wiped out bad in this area, just like the guys here were wiped out bad by the mortar strikes. And these guys right here in the middle were badly wiped out. As the fighting from these forces ceased, these forces now began to move. As this tank right here began to move here, it took a few more shots from a survivor, but they were pinpointed by the ISR quadcopter drones, and they were cut down immediately by crew serve weapon fire as the tank shell was no longer necessary. And then they moved around in conjunction with the other armored forces moving around. This tank moving up here, and this tank right here moving this way. So the tanks were, 3 tanks of the tank platoon were sitting right here, and the other tank had basically moved up here as to give support to the troops, the special operators that had moved up through here beside them, through this busted up, destroyed house, to check it for any survivors. Now they had secured this area in conjunction with the other forces that had moved here. Now that this area was secure, they could now move off the map and sweep the now heavily devastated area that was shelled. But the rest of the fighting that had occurred down in this part of the area happened between this tank platoon here, this squad moving across the railroad tracks, bounding across the tracks and into this wooded area where they kind of were able to maneuver their way around quietly and using their assets to see who was over here. While these forces, this tank here moved here, this tank moved here, and this squad of special operators in a wedge formation moved up with them, and they were taking fire from this wall. This was like a wall, and this was like one of those mega gas stations, like that had like a big store and a gas pump, and then this was like a restaurant, and there were a couple guys hiding behind the restaurant in this parking lot, and there were a bunch of guys hiding behind this concrete wall firing over it. But these tanks just devastated them. As you can see, there's red along this building, and this building's surrounded in red. It's completely shredded up by tank shells. This building's completely gutted, this gas station, which doesn't work because the grid's not working. So there was little danger, at least for the moment, of it completely going up from the tank shelling that hit the store part of the building. And as that happened, these forces then began to move again. While these forces had cleared the flanks, as this squad moved and checked this house, breaking up into 2 stack teams, kicking in the back and front door, moving through, reforming as a full squad going out, and then bounding with this squad that was securing the flanks as they secured the backyards while these guys cleared the house, and then they moved along with them tactically to give them protection. By the time they got here, they greased these guys, and then they went through this house, cleared it, and then they went out to join up with these 2 tanks that were moving this way together right here before they spearheaded an attack into the trailer park. By this time, they had already fled the area, and these guys trying to flee out the front by this trailer park office right here, they had gotten completely cut down by tank fire. As you can see, all the fire right here along this wall of the trailer park. These trailers were completely destroyed up front. They were hit by tank shells, by fragmentation, by frag T shells from the tanks. They were completely annihilated. This building was completely gone. This little office right here, there's like a house. This building was gone. These trailers were all shredded up from small arms and crew serve weapon fire, heavy machine gun fire. This place was a mess. This place was definitely war torn. It was ripped up. And by that point, the tank in the middle with these 2 half squads that formed one whole squad, they smashed in this way, and then they secured this part. So they, by this point, had, after eliminating all of these personnel, these armed civilian combatants running out the front, after they greased them and annihilated them, they just smashed their way into the trailer park and secured it. Now, roughly from this battle that was occurring in this northern part of the area, as gradually while all of this was going on during the hour it was happening, little by little, other companies of these special operators would be basically withdrawn from other parts of the battle and gone to the LZ, and then they would be picked up by the helos, and then they would be flown into the downtown area to conduct their special operation that they had originally been supposed to be conducting anyway. But this didn't deviate from their original planning because they were just getting the most use out of their forces. Instead of their special operators just sitting and waiting on their CCP property for the helos, they were getting use out of them by supporting the armor and mechanized infantry in this big battle here against these armed civilian militia forces that were better equipped, generally speaking, than most of the armed civilians who had no armor, and all they had mostly were pistols and shotguns, which really couldn't do much to any of the Chinese. Some had rifles, but for the most part, it was people that took their preparation seriously, that even had any kind of decent small arms, like actual decent rifles with which to fight back, that they could be like a counter infantry force of sorts. As that was happening and these companies were gradually being shuttled to their official main mission in the downtown area, the fighting was still going on in the center and the south. This particular map is a mile south of this map. This map right here, this 1.5 mile by 1 mile map, there's another few miles off this map that was getting heavily shelled by artillery, which caused all the armed combatants to flee into this area. The same was happening here, basically. Now this, again, was like a mile to the south, and this was another 1.5 mile by 1 mile map. Now this was, again, a mile south of the last map. Now this was a more urbanized type of area. This is a railroad that ran through this semi-industrial and commercial area. This is the Oklahoma River right here. This is a hotel. This is a motel. This is like a bank building, like one of those big bank buildings. These are all businesses. This is like a commercial area right here. This is a railroad bridge right here, and this is a street bridge right here that goes across this river right here. And as you can see, there's brown lining it, which means there's an embankment on each side of this river. And what you have is you have armed civilian militia types using their pickup trucks like technicals, with guys with rifles firing out over the back, sitting in the beds, firing over the trucks. And you have them trying to establish some type of defensive line on this side of the river so that these other guys can try to escape, because the heavy rocket fire from the long-range A300 300-millimeter rockets being fired into this massive area are completely annihilating these armed civilians. Like, they have no recourse against this. I mean, this is total devastation. And not only that, but the fighters patrolling the area could be called in at any time to strafe or drop their limited ground attack munitions just to add to the punishment that was going on here. And there were also more CH-901A loitering munitions that, as they were fired 48 at a time, some veered into the central and southern portions of the battle, as the centralmost portion was just to the north in the mile that separated this map from this map. And this was the southernmost part of it. There was a little more off map, but what was basically occurring was, in this sector here, the armored infantry had two of its companies operating in the area, one being dispersed among this tank company, as there was a full tank company here, and then there was another full tank company interspersed with another armored infantry company that was moving up this way into the area. Of course, they were not moving in dangerous range of the rocket artillery, but you see all these rubbled buildings on the outskirts of the rocket blasts. I mean, they're completely gone. These were big businesses and things like that. They had been completely shattered, this road that going into the rocket strikes. These guys are trying to flee. They're running like hell. They're trying to get out of there. And this area on the other side of the Oklahoma River isn't much safer, as the CH-901As are coming in to hit them in their rear area that they feel is like a safe area for them to try to flee to. But they're about to be cut off as these armored forces rapidly move to engage and destroy their enemies rapidly. I mean, like, in this area right here, there's a railroad embankment that was part of which, running in this map just over a mile to the north a little bit. This railroad embankment goes through this area, through this factory complex right here, this big factory complex. And you have guys trying to hurry and get in here that were running from all the blasts. Like, they're trying to take cover. Like, they're trying to find any type of structure within which they can try to get out of this situation. There's already a whole bunch of them in here. Like, in this factory building right here, there's about 40 of them in this factory building right here. There's some outside of this office type building right here. It's like one of the offices for the factory. And you have another building right here, another office type building. There's about 4 guys behind here. This thing gets obliterated by tanks. Like, this is a tank platoon moving up this way, and this is a mechanized infantry platoon belonging to the same company as this, because there's 3 tank platoons here spread out among 2 mechanized infantry platoons. So the other mechanized infantry platoon, the combat platoon, is moving through this area right here, with the other tank platoon moving up here that had shelled and destroyed this area. And these guys are running like hell too. These guys on this side of the embankment, and these guys here, but they get cut down quick. As this battle in this area was particularly quick because of the heavy weight of the forces being thrown against them. As overall, in this particular battle, as the armor came in full force with the armored infantry that were there accompanying them in their strike, these heavy forces of this armored battalion were striking in the middle to basically break through and encircle both groupings that were even left at this point, and cordoning and sweeping. Like, they were doing a massive cordon and sweep operation, in other words, with assistance from the mechanized infantry battalion arriving on the scene too. They were the ones that would help the armored infantry to methodically and thoroughly clear this entire area. But in the meantime, they were smashing through to separate these forces even more and encircle them in a couple pockets to clear them thoroughly as the mechanized infantry was arriving. The armored infantry of the armored battalion would assist in this. So now, as these forces in this part of the battle were moving across this field right here, this wooded field that had some wooded areas and little small hills, like low rolling hills, and a few houses. There is a platoon of armored infantry vehicles, this being an infantry fighting vehicle, and 2 APCs, basically a VN-20 IFV and a Type 89A APC, Type 89 APC, and another Type 89, another Type 89. And this is a part of a tank platoon. Here's 2 Type 96Bs, another Type 96B, another one, and another one. So there's the 5 tanks of that platoon, and then there's the 5 vehicles of the 1 armored infantry platoon. Then here you have another 5 tanks. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You got the 5 right here. You got 2 other armored infantry vehicles. These are Type 89As. You've got the VN-20 right here, and you got the other Type 89As right here, and then you've got the other tank platoon. And then the 4th and final tank platoon is coming up this way with the last armored infantry platoon with its VN-20 and 4 Type 89A APCs. And these little arrows here are where they're dismounting their squads. So basically, as